Rain poured down. A blood-soaked golden retriever sank its teeth into the billionaire's wrist on the helicopter steps, dragging him down. In the harsh spotlight, its brown eyes shone with fear and love, knowing this was its final breath to save its master's world. Click subscribe to the channel now to watch emotional and dramatic movie stories from us. Rain hammered down on the city like 1,000 frantic drumbeats, the neon glow of old diner signs flickering against slick asphalt streets. It was past midnight, that strange hour when the world held its breath between yesterday's ghosts and tomorrow's hopes. And in apartment 3B on Sycamore Street, Chloe Carter pressed her back against the door chest, heaving as she fumbled with the deadbolt. Bailey pushed his massive head against her thigh, whining low in his chest, golden fur dripping rivulets of cold rain onto the scuffed hardwood. She sank to her knees on the welcome mat, fingers trembling as she unclipped his tactical harness. The room smelled of damp fur and stale coffee grounds. Her lungs burned with exhaustion, but her mind refused rest, replaying the final words of her last informant before everything spiraled out of control. "Bailey?" Her voice broke on the single word, a prayer whispered into fur that smelled of rain and city smog. She buried her face against his neck, feeling the steady thud of his heart, the slow rhythm anchoring her to this moment instead of the abyss clawing at the edges of her sanity. Outside, thunder rolled across the city like God clearing his throat. Lightning illuminated Bailey's deep brown eyes, ancient and knowing as he turned to nuzzle her cheek. His fur was soaked through to the skin strands clumping together, but he didn't shiver. He had been bred for endurance, trained for obedience, forged for loyalty beyond comprehension. Even now, when the world outside threatened to unravel every thread of her resolve, his presence wrapped her in something warm and solid. She pressed her forehead to his, remembering the first time those eyes met hers. It had been 10 years ago, but the memory remained crystalline. She was 18, standing in her grandfather's garage that reeked of machine oil and old leather. Her palms wrapped tight around her elbows to keep herself from trembling. The night before, she'd buried her mother, a heroin overdose victim found in the bathtub of a downtown motel. Chloe had spent hours scrubbing her mother's blood off the white tile floor, retching at the metallic smell, until her grandfather, old Jack Carter, stormed in and pulled her away, his wiry arms surprisingly strong around her grief-shattered shoulders. Now she stood there in the garage, watching him shuffle with stiff knees toward a battered metal kennel pushed against the far wall. Rain drummed hard against the tin roof. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed, climbing up the scales of desperation. She felt hollow, drained of everything except the gnawing certainty that nothing would ever be okay again. "Chloe girl." Her grandfather rasped, his voice the coarse texture of unfiltered cigarettes and decades of unspoken regrets. "Got something for you." She couldn't summon curiosity. Nothing mattered. Not her AP exams, not her part-time barista job, not her boyfriend who hadn't shown up to the funeral, not even the gnawing ache in her belly where hunger used to live before grief devoured everything. Old Jack swung the kennel door open and whistled low. A chubby golden puppy with oversized paws and ears too big for his head stumbled out, blinking sleep from his dark eyes. Chloe's gaze met his, and something fractured inside her chest. The puppy wobbled toward her, on uncertain legs, tail wagging hesitantly, head tilting as if to ask, "Why are you crying?" Her grandfather crouched beside the puppy with a wince, one gnarled hand stroking its silky ears. "This here's Bailey," he said, his voice softening to a tone she'd never heard before. "Named after my first K-9 partner. Best bomb sniffer this county ever saw. Won medals, saved lives, slept on my boots every night." The puppy flopped onto his back paws, curled against his chest, tongue lolling sideways as he gazed at Chloe upside down. A strangled laugh tore from her throat, rusty and painful. Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and silent. Her grandfather's faded blue eyes, sharp despite cataracts, bored into hers. "Listen to me, girl. Life's gonna knock you down more times than I can count. But you ain't gotta get up alone." He nodded toward Bailey. "He'll remind you of that when I'm gone." That was the day Chloe first felt the flicker of hope again. She took Bailey home that night, curled against his trembling body on her thin twin mattress, and let his tiny puppy snores lull her to sleep for the first time in weeks. Thunder boomed again, shaking her back to the present. She blinked away tears and stood wiping rain and grief from her cheeks with the heel of her palm. Bailey followed, nails clicking on the floorboards as she moved to the kitchenette. She opened a cabinet, grabbing the old tin of dog food, and dumped half into his stainless steel bowl. The metallic clatter echoed through the silent apartment. He sniffed the food, then looked up at her eyes, solemn. He wouldn't eat until she did. She sighed, opened the fridge, and pulled out a half-empty carton of milk. She poured a glass, took a sip, and forced herself to swallow despite the nausea curling in her gut. "Happy now?" she whispered, voice rough. Bailey licked her ankle in response before finally lowering his head to eat. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the corkboard by her window. Dozens of photos pinned up with brass tacks. Children's faces blurred CCTV captures of shady back-alley meetings, mugshots of men who smirked into the camera with cold, dead eyes. At the center, circled 3 times in red marker, was Ethan Maddox. Her stomach tightened as she read the words scribbled beside his photo in thick black Sharpie. "He sells babies. Find him. End it." She picked up her Glock from the counter, ejecting the magazine and checking the chamber in one fluid motion. Training? Discipline? Routine? All she had left. Her hands shook despite it. Bailey finished his food and patted over, pressing his head against her thigh again. She set the gun down and sank to the floor beside him, wrapping her arms around his thick neck. The smell of wet fur was strong, earthy, and real. The smell of something that didn't lie, didn't cheat, didn't murder. She pressed her lips to the top of his head. "Bailey," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're the only reason I'm still here." She closed her eyes, letting herself remember. She was 23 when her grandfather died. Stroke swift and merciful, they said. She'd held his hand in the hospital room, feeling the papery thinness of his skin, the tremor of old age and fear that even he couldn't hide at the end. "Bailey," he croaked, eyes fluttering under heavy lids. Chloe leaned closer, clutching his hand tighter. "He's a good boy, Chloe girl," he wheezed. "He'll keep you safe. You keep him safe too." Then his breathing hitched, rattled, and stopped. The monitors screamed, but Chloe didn't hear them. All she heard was the soft whine from under the hospital bed. Bailey's nose pressed against her knee-tail, thumping weakly in confused grief. At the funeral, Bailey lay across her feet the entire service, his heavy warmth anchoring her against the ripping tide of loss. Neighbors murmured about how well-trained he was, how obedient. But Chloe knew it wasn't obedience. It was love. Simple, unbreakable love. After everyone left, she stayed behind, fingers digging into the fresh-turned earth until her nails bled. Bailey lay beside her, silent, and still, his head on her thigh, eyes closed but ears flicking every time she sobbed. That night she whispered to him, in the darkness of their tiny apartment, "You're all I have left." His tail thumped once against the floorboards before sleep claimed them both. Rain lashed against the window, slanting sideways in gusts of autumn wind. Chloe opened her eyes and stared into Bailey's face, seeing the faint gray creeping into his muzzle. He was 6 now, in the prime of his life, strong and fast, but time left its fingerprints on even the best of them. She tightened her arms around him, ignoring the twinge in her wrist from where one of Ethan's men had twisted it earlier. Her breath shuddered out between clenched teeth. "Bailey is the last gift he gave me," she whispered into his fur voice, raw with grief and resolve. "And the only reason I don't give up." Bailey tilted his head, ears perked forward, as if listening understanding in his dark, intelligent eyes. Thunder rumbled again, shaking the windows in their frames. In that moment, the apartment was a fortress against the world outside. Just a girl and her dog, bruised and battered, but unbroken. She leaned back against the door, eyes locked on the corkboard across the room. Ethan Maddox's face stared back at her, smug and untouchable. But he didn't know Chloe Carter. And he didn't know Bailey. She curled her fingers into Bailey's damp fur and felt his pulse strong and steady under her palm. He leaned into her touch, heavy and warm and alive. Her grandfather's voice echoed through her mind, gravelly and fierce. "Life's gonna knock you down, girl. But you ain't gotta get up alone." Lightning flashed again, illuminating Bailey's eyes. Chloe closed hers, letting the rumble of thunder drown out her fear. Tomorrow she would go back into the dark. Tomorrow she would take the fight to Ethan Maddox. But tonight, for these few precious hours, she allowed herself to be just a girl, clinging to the last piece of her family. Bailey pressed closer, and his deep, rumbling sigh told her he understood. And somewhere deep inside, under the bruises and exhaustion and gnawing grief, Chloe Carter felt the ember of something small and dangerous flicker back to life. Hope. Rain slid down the windows of the Park View Grand like tears on glass, refracting the chandeliers inside into 1,000 fractured constellations. Chloe Carter stood across the street in a dark green Ford Explorer engine, idling windshield wipers, squeaking against the deluge. Bailey sat beside her in the passenger seat, wearing his tactical vest with a small matte black GoPro clipped to its chest plate. The wipers swept away the rain for half a second, revealing valet attendants in sleek black uniforms, sprinting back and forth under giant umbrellas. Women in cocktail dresses draped in diamonds and men with steel-gray hair and tailored suits slipped into the building, their laughter muffled by the glass and storm. Chloe drummed her fingers against the steering wheel. Eyes narrowed at the revolving door. Her pulse thudded heavy in her throat. She reached down, rubbing Bailey's ear absently, feeling the cool, rubbery edge of his collar tags beneath her fingertips. Ready to dance with the devil boy, she murmured. Bailey licked her wrist, once his dark eyes calm, eternal. Rain drummed harder against the roof, a percussion of destiny. She popped open the glove compartment and pulled out a silver lipstick tube, twisting the base until the creamy rose tip appeared. With her free hand, she flipped down the visor mirror, smudged with fingerprints, and the faint scent of gun oil from her cig tucked against her ribs. She dabbed the lipstick on her lips, her movements precise, controlled. Every detail mattered tonight. She twisted the tube shut and dropped it into her clutch before reaching for Bailey's harness, checking the camera feed on her phone. The image flickered once before steadying. The camera's wide-angle lens captured everything in crisp grayscale, feeding straight to her off-grid server. Evidence, insurance, justice. Her phone buzzed with the notification, a text from Lieutenant Harris, confirming he's there. Security thicker than Fort Knox. Don't get dead. Chloe huffed a silent laugh and tucked the phone away. Don't get dead, she echoed under her breath. Sounded easy when it wasn't your life dangling over the abyss. She slipped out into the rain hood, pulled up against the downpour, Bailey trotting at her side. Together they crossed the street, weaving between parked cars, until they reached the side entrance reserved for catering staff and security detail. Chloe flashed a fake ID badge at the doorman, a bored teenager with acne scars blooming across his jawline. He didn't even glance at Bailey before waving them through. Inside the hallway, smelled of bleach and floor wax, fluorescent lights humming overhead. The air buzzed with nervous energy, a stark contrast to the opulence of the ballroom beyond. Chloe unclipped Bailey's leash, crouching to check his harness one last time. The camera light blinked softly. Operational. Stay close, she whispered, pressing her forehead to his for a beat. His breath warmed her cheek in silent reply. She straightened shoulders, rolling back as she slipped into her role. The staff elevator carried them up 3 floors to the grand ballroom lobby. As the door slid open, a wall of music and perfume hit her like a wave. A string quartet played Vivaldi's Winter's sharp and urgent notes, slicing through the murmurs of polite conversation and clinking glasses. Crystal chandeliers glittered above polished marble floors. Waiters glided between donors and dignitaries, balancing trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Chloe slipped in among them, eyes scanning for security cameras' exits and threats. Bailey padded silently beside her, weaving through the crowd with unerring purpose, his vest marked, "Service dog, do not pet." People's gazes slid off him, focused on the swirling ballroom. Across the room, framed by gold filigree columns and lit like a king on his throne, stood Ethan Maddox. Chloe's breath hitched. She forced herself to inhale through her nose, slow and even, as she studied him. He wore a navy 3-piece suit that hugged his powerful frame, silver cufflinks glinting under chandelier light. His salt and pepper hair was cut in an elegant fade, combed back from his broad forehead. His jaw was clean-shaven, lips curved into a politician's smile as he spoke to a cluster of board members from his pharmaceutical empire. Everything about him radiated power, the easy stance hand stuffed casually in his pocket, Rolex gleaming. But it was his eyes that chilled Chloe to her marrow. Icy, calculating, predator eyes. She moved closer, pretending to study a silent auction display of rare wine bottles. Bailey sat at her feet, eyes locked on Ethan. The GoPro on his vest whirred softly, recording everything from his vantage point. Chloe's earpiece crackled to life, Lieutenant Harris's voice taut with adrenaline. Visual confirmed. Facial recognition matches. You're on your own in there, Carter. Don't engage. Just get the footage. Copy that, she whispered. Ethan chuckled at something one of the board members said, tilting his head back in a false display of warmth. As he turned slightly, Chloe saw the man behind him. Gregory Holt, his head of security, former special forces, rumored to have killed a child soldier in Somalia. Holt's eyes swept the room constantly, never resting. Chloe turned away just before his gaze skimmed over her. She moved toward the catering entrance, heart hammering. Bailey followed, ears pricked forward, muscles tense beneath his golden coat. She reached the shadows beside the dessert table, unzipped her clutch, and pulled out a small parabolic mic disguised as a makeup compact. She aimed it at Ethan, twisting the dial until his voice cut through the static. The neural stem cell serum trials will begin next quarter. Yes, with full-term neonates harvested from the Mercy program. No consent isn't an issue. They're unregistered births from the shelter network. legally invisible. Chloe's stomach rolled. The board member chuckled softly. Ethan continued his tone as casual as if discussing wine pairings. Their liabilities otherwise. But under our program, they'll die contributing to science. It's cleaner this way. Bailey whined low in his throat. Chloe pressed a trembling hand to his back fingers, buried in damp fur. Her vision blurred with tears she couldn't afford. Ethan lifted his glass, clinking it against his colleagues. To the future of longevity. To immortality, the other man echoed. The string quartet shifted to a lilting waltz. Couples began to drift onto the dance floor. Chloe slipped the mic back into her clutched thumb, hovering over her phone screen to check the GoPro feed. Clear, crisp, time-stamped. Movement to her right caught her attention. Gregory Holt was scanning the crowd again, and his gaze paused on her longer than comfort allowed. Chloe turned her face away, tucking her hair behind her ear, but her pulse roared in her neck like a war drum. Holt's footsteps approached deliberate and heavy, each step vibrating through the polished floor and into her bones. Bailey shifted, sensing her fear. His ears flicked back, body tensing. Chloe squeezed the base of his neck harness, praying he'd stay calm. Miss Holt's voice was a smoker's growl dipped in disdain. "This area is for catering staff only." "I'm just—" Chloe began, but her voice cracked. Holt's eyes narrowed, flicking from her trembling hands to the GoPro strapped to Bailey's chest. Her heart plummeted. He sees it. "Step away from the dog," he ordered. Her mind whirled. No weapon, no backup, nowhere to run. Bailey's low growl rumbled in his chest, vibrating against her shin. Holt reached for his earpiece, murmuring something she couldn't hear. Security would be on her in seconds. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She tried to think, tried to calculate an escape, but the walls pressed in the chandeliers spun. The music blurred into a distorted cacophony. And then Bailey moved. With a sudden fluid twist, he lunged forward, pressing his massive golden body against Holt's legs. The guard staggered back, surprised, reaching for his weapon. Bailey let out a yelp, high-pitched and urgent, then collapsed sideways against Holt's boots' legs, splaying in awkward angles. His tail thumped once weakly. Holt cursed under his breath, distracted. Chloe moved without thought, pure training and survival instinct. She slammed her knee into Holt's thigh, his weakest point, and as he stumbled, she yanked Bailey's harness, dragging him upright. Together they bolted into the swirling mass of dancing bodies. Music swelled around them, strings and brass and piano weaving a frantic soundtrack to their flight. Chloe ducked behind a pillar chest, heaving adrenaline roaring through her veins. She glanced down at Bailey. His eyes met hers sharp and focused no trace of pain in their depths. "Good boy," she whispered, tears burning her throat. Holt's voice barked orders over the security channel. Guards began sweeping the room, their black suits like sharks circling blood. Chloe wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, smearing lipstick across her cheek. She forced herself to inhale, to center, to focus. Bailey pressed his flank against her leg, vibrating with readiness. His tail flicked once, a silent signal between soldier and partner. She pulled her phone from her clutched thumb, hovering over the Send All Data button. Her hand shook so badly she nearly dropped it. Bailey licked her knuckles, steadying her. She exhaled a single word, her voice shaking with fear and certainty and grief and love. Together, and pressed Send. The ballroom glowed with candlelight and wealth music soaring above polished marble floors and swirling silk gowns. But in a small security room 2 levels below, the glow came only from monitors, flickering blue and gray, casting shadows across Ethan Maddox's angular face as he leaned forward in his leather chair. Gregory Holt stood behind him, arms folded, jaw clenched so hard the tendons quivered beneath his skin. The monitor feed showed Chloe ducking behind a pillar, Bailey pressed to her leg, his GoPro lens glinting in the chandelier light. "Pause," Ethan ordered. The footage froze on Chloe's face. Her hood had slipped back in the chaos, revealing sharp cheekbones and the fierce, defiant eyes of a woman cornered but unbroken. "Zoom in," Ethan said, his voice calm, almost amused. The tech obeyed, his fingers trembling as he expanded the frame. Chloe's NYPD undercover badge glimmered under her jacket, half concealed. Ethan's lips twitched in a smile devoid of warmth. "Police," he said softly. "It always comes back to the police." He drummed his fingers against the mahogany armrest, eyes locked on Chloe's frozen image. The music from the ballroom filtered faintly through the ventilation system, a haunting waltz that felt almost mocking. He inhaled slowly, savoring the moment. Then his gaze shifted to Gregory. "Bring her to me," he said. "Alive." Gregory's eyebrow twitched. "Alive. You want a hostage negotiation?" "No." Ethan replied, standing and smoothing his tailored suit with deliberate precision. "I want her to watch what happens when someone thinks they can threaten me. Then you can kill her." Gregory hesitated a fraction of a second before nodding. Understood. Ethan turned back to the monitors as Chloe darted from her hiding place, weaving through the oblivious dancers toward the service exit. Bailey stayed pressed to her thigh head, low eyes scanning for threats. Such loyalty, Ethan murmured. His eyes narrowed, almost curious. Such a waste. Chloe's boots slammed against the tiled hallway as she sprinted down the service corridor, chest heaving, adrenaline surging like wildfire through her veins. Bailey bounded beside her paws, slipping on the wet floor as they rounded a corner toward the freight elevator. She skidded to a halt and punched the call button. The doors stayed closed. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Come on, come on, come on. Behind them, men's voices barked orders. Heavy boots pounded closer. Bailey growled low in his chest, hackles rising. Chloe dropped to one knee, fumbling at his harness fingers, trembling as she checked the GoPro feed. Still transmitting, still recording. Her thumb hovered over the emergency broadcast command. If she pressed it, the footage would upload directly to the FBI cloud drive Harris had arranged, broadcasting Ethan Maddox's confession to half the Federal Cyber Division. But before she could act, a massive arm wrapped around her neck from behind, dragging her backward with brutal force. Her scream choked off as her feet left the ground. Bailey lunged, teeth bared, clamping down on the attacker's calf with a vicious snarl. Blood sprayed against the wall tiles. The man roared in pain, but didn't let go. Another guard swung a baton down, slamming it into Bailey's ribs. Chloe heard the crack, a muffled pop that twisted her stomach into knots. Bailey yelped, but didn't release his grip, jaws locked with desperate strength. The first man's grip tightened around her throat, cutting off her air. Black spots swam at the edges of her vision. She clawed at his forearm nails, raking deep furrows into his flesh. But he didn't flinch. The second guard swung again this time, hitting Bailey's skull. The dog's eyes rolled back, legs buckling. Blood matted his fur as he slumped to the tiles with a low whimper. "No!" Chloe screamed, voice ragged and broken. The pain in her throat exploded into darkness as the world slid sideways, sound fading into a dull, pulsing roar. When she woke, the cold was the first thing she felt. It seeped into her bones, numbing her fingertips and biting at her lungs with every shallow breath. The smell of bleach and raw meat choked her. Metal racks loomed above her head, stacked with plastic-wrapped sides of beef. Dim fluorescent lights flickered overhead. She tried to sit up, but her arms were pinned behind her back, wrists zip-tied so tight she couldn't feel her fingers. Her head throbbed where it had struck the tile floor. A hot trickle of blood slid down her temple, dripping onto the frozen concrete beneath her. "Rise and shine." Ethan's voice cut through the darkness like a scalpel. Chloe forced her eyes open. He stood at the edge of the meat rack aisle, perfectly pressed suit, immaculate despite the industrial grime. Behind him loomed Gregory Holt, his arms crossed over his massive chest. Bloodstains darkening the knees of his trousers. Chloe's gaze darted around, searching desperately. Then she saw him. Bailey lay on his side a few feet away, chest rising and falling shallowly. Blood clotted the golden fur around his head and shoulder. His eyes were half open, glazed with pain. When he saw her, his tail thumped weakly against the icy floor. "Bailey," she rasped. Her voice broke into a sob. Ethan chuckled softly, the sound almost tender. Touching. Truly. He crouched in front of her, balanced on the balls of his polished leather shoes, forearms resting casually on his thighs. His cologne smelled of sandalwood and power. He tilted his head, studying her with the curiosity of a scientist examining a lab rat moments before the needle. "You're quite the nuisance, Officer Carter," he said. "Undercover 3 months. Impressive infiltration. Your little dog here is quite the asset. I'll have to remember that for future acquisitions." She spat at him. The blood-flecked saliva splattered against his cheek. He closed his eyes, inhaled, then wiped it away with a pristine white handkerchief. "Kill her," he said softly, not looking at Gregory. "But make sure she sees the dog die first." Gregory stepped forward, reaching for the cig holstered at his hip. Chloe's heart thudded wildly. Her gaze locked on Bailey, his dark eyes full of pain but still focused on her. Tears spilled down her cheeks, freezing almost instantly in the bitter cold. "Bailey," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Bailey, listen to me." She shifted forward as far as her restraints would allow, pressing her forehead to his. His breath came in short, ragged pants. She could smell the blood, hot and metallic and sharp against the cold meat tang of the freezer. With trembling fingers, she fumbled at her belt, finding the tiny micro SD card she'd hidden behind her radio battery. The evidence. Ethan's confession. The only chance to save the children trapped in his secret facilities. She pressed it into the slot, hidden inside Bailey's collar tag, the metal plate engraved with his name. Tears blurred her vision as she snapped it shut with a click that sounded too loud in the silent freezer. "Run," she whispered, pressing her face against his, feeling his warmth seep into her frozen skin. "Run, Bailey. Find them. Save them. Go." His tail thumped weakly again once, twice, as if he understood. Gregory grabbed her hair, yanking her head back so hard, pain flashed white behind her eyes. She screamed. Ethan stood brushing invisible dust from his trousers' eyes, cold as glaciers. "I want her gone before dawn," he said, turning to leave. "Dump them both in the river. No bodies, no questions." Bailey whined, a sound torn from the depths of his chest. His paws twitched against the concrete claws, scraping faintly. Chloe met his eyes, searching for something, anything to hold on to in the darkness. "You're a good boy," she whispered, sobs shaking her shoulders. "You're the best boy. I love you, Bailey." Gregory's shadow loomed over them both as he drew his gun, chambering around with a sharp metallic snap that echoed through the meat racks like a death knell. Chloe closed her eyes, pressing her cheek against Bailey's fur, breathing in the scent of rain and sweat and dog, and she prayed. The cold burned his lungs like fire. Each ragged breath sent knives of pain stabbing through Bailey's chest, the shallow wound along his flank, seeping hot blood into his dense golden fur. He stumbled against the metal racks lining the freezer's walls, claws scraping across the slick concrete as he struggled to stay upright. His ears rang with Chloe's screams, echoes chasing him through the shadows. But her last words cut deeper than any bullet. "Run, Bailey. Save them. Run!" He forced his trembling legs to move, stepping over her slumped body, ears pinned back against the metallic clamor of boots pounding the corridor behind him. The air smelled of blood and bleach and death. He could hear the men arguing outside the freezer door. "Check if she's dead. Leave her. Maddox wants the bodies gone by dawn." Bailey's gaze darted to the far corner of the freezer, where 2 plastic crates sat atop wooden pallets. Their lids were half open, revealing bundled blankets that twitched and kicked with faint, helpless movement. The smell of milk ammonia and newborn tears hit his nose like a freight train slicing through the fog of pain and fear. 2 babies, human puppies, weak, helpless, crying for the mother who couldn't come. His chest tightened, a primal ache vibrating through his ribs. He limped forward, muzzle nudging the first bundle. Tiny fingers curled around the soft fur of his neck. The infant whimpered, face red and scrunched in fear and cold. Bailey licked its cheek, once tasting salt and grief and innocence. The second baby squirmed in its crate, letting out a thin, reedy wail. Bailey turned his massive head, swaying from blood loss, and gently grabbed the edge of its blanket between his teeth. The tiny bundle was light as feathers, but heavy as destiny. His ears twitched, catching the sudden silence outside the freezer door. The latch clanked. The door began to swing open, metal hinges squealing in protest. "Run!" he bolted. The crates crashed to the floor behind him as he surged through the gap, fur brushing against cold steel. Men shouted, hands clawing at guns and radios. Bailey didn't stop. His claws scrambled for traction across the slick tile as he turned sharply down the dim hallway, muscles screaming in protest. A gunshot cracked like thunder. The bullet grazed his shoulder, slicing through flesh just beneath his harness strap. Pain exploded down his leg, nearly buckling him to the ground. He staggered sideways into a utility cart, sending boxes of latex gloves and bleach rolling across the floor. "Stop that damn dog," someone roared. Bailey's vision blurred, shadows swimming at the edges of his sight. He could taste blood in his mouth, thick and metallic. But the infant whimpering against his chest and the tiny fingers clinging to his ruff rooted him to reality. "Run!" He pushed forward, forcing his legs to move despite the pain. His body felt heavy and disconnected, each stride an act of will rather than instinct. He burst through the loading dock doors into the icy midnight rain. The world exploded in water and wind and darkness. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the asphalt beneath his paws. Rain hammered down in sheets, soaking his fur in seconds. His breath came in wheezing gasps, every inhale a knife blade slicing his lungs. He skidded across the slick concrete nails, scraping for purchase before regaining his footing and charging toward the tree line beyond the fence. Behind him, men spilled out of the warehouse flashlights, sweeping the yard in frantic arcs. One beam caught his tail for a split second, illuminating the dark smear of blood trailing behind him like spilled ink on snow. Over there, by the dumpsters, gunshots rang out, bullets whistling past his ears and splashing into muddy puddles. Bailey zigzagged, legs pumping, muscles tearing with each bound. Pain radiated up his flank from the grazing wound, the heat of it dulled by the icy rain pouring off his back. He reached the chain-link fence at the edge of the loading yard. Lights from the warehouse cast his shadow long and distorted across the corrugated metal panels. He could hear men cursing, radios crackling with orders. Bailey shifted his grip on the infant's blanket, planting his paws and leaping at the fence. His claws scrambled against the metal hind legs, scrabbling for purchase. The babies whimpered softly, their tiny hearts fluttering against his chest like sparrows trapped in wire cages. He slipped, fell hard onto his wounded shoulder. Agony flared so bright his vision whitened. But he forced himself up again, shaking rain from his ears, his jaws tightening around the baby bundle. He backed up, gathered every ounce of strength left in his battered body, and lunged at the fence once more. This time he cleared it, his back legs catching briefly on the top rail before he crashed into the muddy grass beyond. He landed hard, the jolt nearly knocking the breath from his lungs. But he stayed upright, swaying on trembling legs. The forest loomed ahead, shadows and mist and safety. Bailey staggered forward, the babies pressed to his chest, their warmth like embers in the freezing darkness. Thunder rolled above, rattling the skeletal trees. Rain fell in sheets so thick he could barely see his paws. But his nose told him the way. Earth, sap, pine, wet soil. 1,000 scents weaving a map only he could read. His paws sank into mossy mud, each step pulling at his legs like quicksand. But he kept moving, weaving between trunks, slipping through brambles that tore at his fur and left streaks of blood against the wet leaves. Behind him, men shouted and cursed, their lights bobbing uselessly at the fence line. Bailey ran until their voices faded into the storm's howling silence. He stumbled into a small clearing, gasping for breath. His legs buckled, sending him crashing to the cold earth. The babies whimpered, their voices thin and wavering in the roar of the rain. He nudged them closer, curling his massive body around their tiny forms, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the trees in stark white brilliance. Thunder boomed so loud it vibrated through his bones. Bailey closed his eyes, against the storm, pressing his nose into the infant's blankets. Their smells filled his senses, cutting through pain and fear and darkness. And in the black behind his eyelids, a memory bloomed. He was a puppy again, floppy-eared and wide-eyed, the world an endless kaleidoscope of smells and colors. The old man stood before him, tall and broad and solid, wearing worn denim overalls stained with motor oil. His hands were thick and calloused, smelling of leather and coffee and gunpowder. His voice rumbled low and gentle, vibrating through Bailey's tiny bones. "Come on now, boy," he said, crouching down with a squeak of old knees. "Find it." He tossed a battered tennis ball across the dusty yard. Bailey watched it bounce once, twice, then rolled onto his back instead, batting at a drifting dandelion seed with his oversized paw. The old man chuckled deep and warm. "Lazy mutt," he teased, ruffling Bailey's ears until the puppy squirmed with delight. Then his voice softened, turning serious in that way humans had, when truth needed to land hard and true. "Listen close, Bailey," he said, tapping a thick finger against the puppy's chest. "One day you'll be big and strong, smarter than any dog on this block. But none of that'll matter if you ain't got this here." He tapped Bailey's chest again, right over his thundering little heart. "A good dog's worth ain't in how loud he barks or how fast he runs," he said. "It's in whether he knows who needs him most." He leaned in closer, his breath warm with the scent of peppermint and old bourbon. Bailey's tail wagged against the dirt. "Remember this, boy. A good dog never leaves behind the ones who need him. Not ever." Bailey opened his eyes, staring into the rain-lashed darkness of the forest. The thunder rolled again, vibrating through the ground beneath his paws. He shifted, testing his injured leg. Pain shot up his side, sharp and biting, but his vision stayed clear. He looked down at the babies, nestled against his chest, their tiny faces scrunched in discomfort, mouths opening in silent cries. Their skin was cold, too cold. They needed warmth, milk, safety, humans. He sniffed the wind, filtering the scents through the ancient coding written into his blood and bones. Water, pine sap, smoke, human. Somewhere beyond the trees, a chimney puffed wood smoke into the storm. A cabin, shelter. Bailey forced himself up, grunting against the pain. His legs trembled, but they held. He shifted his grip on the baby bundle, adjusting his teeth around the blanket so he wouldn't bite down too hard. The other infant he nudged forward with his nose, urging it back into the curve of his chest before gripping the edge of its blanket. He began to walk. Each step was a battle. His vision swam, the world narrowing to a tunnel of shadows and rain. The babies whimpered, their cries thin and fading, spurring him forward with desperate urgency. Lightning lit the path ahead, revealing a rough dirt road winding through the trees. The scent of humans grew stronger. Smoke, coffee, diesel, old canvas tarps, life. Bailey pressed on paws, sinking into muddy tire ruts, claws scraping against hidden rocks. His lungs burned with every breath, the taste of blood bitter on his tongue. But he didn't stop. Because he remembered, a good dog never leaves behind the ones who need him. And these tiny humans needed him more than anything in this world. He stumbled out onto the road just as the headlights appeared blinding in the storm. A battered pickup skidded to a halt, tires splashing water into the ditch. The driver's door flew open, and a figure ran toward him, silhouetted by the truck's interior lights. Bailey's legs gave out. He crumpled to the wet gravel, curling his body protectively around the babies as the figure dropped to its knees before him. "Oh my God." A man's voice choked rough with shock and something deeper. "Jesus Christ." Strong hands scooped the infants from Bailey's chest, cradling them against a warm flannel shirt. Bailey blinked up at the man's face, blurred by rain and exhaustion. Brown eyes, stubbled jaw, grief carved into every line. "It's okay, boy," the man whispered, tears mingling with rain on his cheeks. "You're safe. They're safe." Bailey's vision dimmed. He felt warm hands under his chest, lifting him gently. The world tilted sideways, and the last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was the man's voice breaking in prayer. "God, please, don't take him too." The rain came down in sheets, each drop as cold as betrayal. It pounded against the tin roof of the small cedar cabin tucked deep into Oregon's pine forest, drumming out a rhythm older than grief itself. Inside, Lucas Miller sat at the scarred oak table, fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. Steam rose from the black coffee, curling into the shadows that gathered in every corner of the dim kitchen. He stared into the dark liquid as if it could tell him what to do next with his life. But coffee held no answers, just as bourbon hadn't, just as pills hadn't, just as therapy hadn't. The ghosts always came back. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, rattling the old glass windows in their frames. A log popped in the cast iron stove, sending sparks skittering across the metal. Lucas flinched at the sudden noise, a muscle ticking along his jaw. He set the mug down with deliberate care, exhaling a shaky breath as he pressed his thumb against the pulse hammering in his throat. "You're not there anymore," he told himself. "You're not there." But his body didn't listen. It never did. Then he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind. A whimper carried through the storm, thin and desperate like a coyote pup lost in the dark. He froze, head tilted, breath caught in his chest. There it was again. Higher this time, cutting through the rain's relentless roar. Lucas pushed back from the table so fast his chair tipped and fell with a dull thud. He grabbed the old military field jacket hanging by the door, shrugging it on as he yanked his boots from under the bench. His fingers trembled with urgency as he jammed them into the mud-caked leather. He didn't bother lacing them before he wrenched the door open and stepped out into the storm. The wind slapped him in the face with icy rain, soaking his hair in seconds. He squinted against it, scanning the tree line where the old logging road cut through the undergrowth. The darkness between the pines seemed alive, shifting and whispering with secrets only the dead could hear. "Hello?" He called, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Is someone there?" Silence answered him, broken only by the pounding rain. Then he saw movement near the edge of the clearing. A shape stumbling forward low to the ground, weaving side to side with exhaustion. Lucas stepped off the porch, boots sinking into mud that sucked at his soles. He squinted through the downpour. A dog. Big, golden, dragging something. No, not something. Somethings. Two small bundles pressed to its chest, wrapped in blood-streaked blankets. The dog's head hung low, ears pinned back, legs trembling with every step. Lucas's heart stopped. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. He ran. Mud sucked at his boots. Icy water splashed up his jeans, but he barely felt it. The dog collapsed just as he reached it, its massive body hitting the wet earth with a muted thud. Lucas dropped to his knees, hands already moving on instinct, peeling back soaked blankets. Two babies. Infants. Their skin bluish-purple from the cold lips parted in weak, silent cries. One lay limp, eyelids fluttering as its tiny chest shuddered with each fading breath. The other whimpered, eyes squeezed shut, fists clenching with fragile fury against the world's cruelty. Lucas's vision blurred. For a moment, he wasn't kneeling in the rain-soaked Oregon woods. He was back in Kandahar, under a moonless sky, cradling the limp body of an Afghan child pulled from the rubble of a drone strike. The same pale lips, the same faint, dying heartbeat fluttering against his palm. "Not again," he choked out, voice breaking. "Not again, God, please." He shook himself back into the present. Training took over. He scooped both babies into his arms, clutching them tight to his chest to share his body heat. Their skin was ice against his ribs. Their hearts fluttered like hummingbird wings trapped under glass. His eyes darted to the dog. Blood pooled beneath its shoulder where the fur was matted dark. Its eyes were half closed, breathing ragged tongue lolling slightly. But when Lucas shifted, the dog's gaze snapped to him. Pupils blown wide with pain, but burning with something deeper. A plea. An order. A final mission passed to the only human within reach. "Okay," Lucas rasped. "Okay, buddy. I've got them. I've got them." The dog's tail thumped once feebly against the mud. Its massive head dropped to the earth ears, flicking weakly against the rain. Lucas surged to his feet, clutching the babies to his chest with one arm as he looped the other under the dog's chest strap. He grunted with effort, half carrying, half dragging the heavy animal across the clearing. The mud sucked at his boots, rain lashed his face, lightning strobed across the black sky. Left foot, right foot. Breathe. Move. Save them. He staggered up the cabin steps and kicked the door open with his heel. Warmth hit him like a punch, the wood stove crackling merrily in the gloom. He dropped to his knees in front of the hearth, laying the babies on the worn wool rug. The dog collapsed beside them, chest heaving with shallow, painful breaths. Lucas stripped off his soaked jacket, wrapping it around the infants. Their skin was like marble under his fingers. He cursed under his breath, adrenaline sharpening his focus to a razor edge. He grabbed the emergency thermal blanket from his medical kit, tucking it around them with fast, practiced movements. Then he moved to the stove, yanking the old enamel kettle off the burner and pouring steaming water into a bowl. He dipped 2 small towels into the hot water, wrung them out, and pressed them gently against the babies' bellies and feet. "Come on," he whispered, voice shaking. "Stay with me. Stay with me, little ones." One infant let out a thin wail, high and desperate. Lucas's chest caved in around the sound. Tears stung his eyes, blurring the small clenched fists waving weakly above the blanket. Memories punched through him, a tiny blue onesie, a plastic hospital crib, the heart monitor beeping steadily beside his sleeping son. Until it didn't. Not today, he ground out, jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "I'm not losing another child today." He checked their breathing again. The stronger baby gasped in uneven rhythm, ribs hitching with effort. The weaker one barely moved, chest fluttering with shallow swells. Lucas pressed 2 fingers to its sternum, feeling the faint, thready pulse. "Start compressions if it stops," he thought automatically. Warm oxygen, glucose in that order. Stabilize, transport prey. He unzipped his field kit, pulling out a small bulb syringe. He suctioned their noses and mouths in swift, gentle motions, clearing mucus and rainwater from their tiny airways. The weaker baby coughed once, a thin, rattling sound. Its chest rose slightly higher on the next breath. "That's it, Lucas," whispered, tears spilling down his cheeks. "That's it. Keep fighting." He looked up at the dog. The golden giant lay stretched on its side chest, rising and falling with harsh, ragged sounds. Blood seeped from the graze wound along its shoulder, mixing with rainwater to form dark rivulets across the floorboards. Its eyes were half open, watching Lucas with solemn, unwavering focus. "Hang on, buddy," Lucas said hoarsely. He crawled to the dog's side, pressing his palm against the wound. The bleeding had slowed, but the dog's gums were pale when he lifted its lips to check. Hypovolemic shock. Blood loss. Cold. Exhaustion. He rummaged in his kit for gauze and tape, cleaning the wound with iodine before wrapping it tightly. The dog flinched, but didn't whine, his massive head turning just enough to rest against the baby's. The faintest wag of his tail brushed against Lucas's knee. "Good boy," Lucas whispered, voice breaking. "Good. Good boy." Lightning split the sky outside, illuminating the cabin in stark flashes. Thunder rolled overhead, rattling the window panes. The stove popped and hissed as rain leaked down the chimney, steam curling into the dim room. Lucas sat back on his heels, breathing hard, chest aching with grief and adrenaline. He pressed his trembling hands to his face, wiping away tears and rain and blood. In front of him lay 2 newborns, fragile and alive. Beside them, a dying dog who had carried them through hell. And somewhere out in the storm and darkness was the nightmare that had done this. That was coming to finish it. Lucas closed his eyes. For a moment he saw his son's face, laughing in the sunlit yard, chocolate ice cream smeared across his chin. He saw his wife's face, hollow with rage and grief, as she screamed that it was his fault, all of it, everything. He opened his eyes. The cabin came back into focus. The babies whimpered softly, their cries weak but growing stronger with each passing minute. The dog's eyes locked on his, dark and endless and pleading. "Save them!" Lucas drew a shuddering breath, his chest tightening around the single certainty that blazed through the ashes of his soul. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, I will." He stood, legs trembling, and reached for the satellite phone hanging above the wood stove. As his shaking fingers punched in the numbers, he kept his gaze locked on the babies. 911, what is your emergency? My name is Dr. Lucas Miller, he said, voice steady, despite the tears streaming down his cheeks. I need an ambulance and law enforcement at 1247 County Road 16. 2 neonates, hypothermic, possible abduction victims, and someone tried to kill them. He paused, staring at the dog's quiet, exhausted eyes. And there's a dog here too, he said softly. A hero? You're going to need to bring a vet. Outside, thunder growled across the night sky as the storm raged on. Inside, a man who thought his life was over knelt on the worn wooden floor, clutching 2 tiny miracles to his chest. And for the first time in years, Lucas Miller prayed, not for forgiveness, not for salvation, but for the chance to be the man these babies, and this dying dog, needed him to be. The storm raged through the Oregon night, peeling shingles from roofs, bending young pines sideways, and flooding county roads with muddy torrents. Lightning clawed at the black sky, illuminating the landscape in stark white flashes. It was during one of these electric heartbeats that Lucas saw her. She lay crumpled beside the loading dock dumpster, half buried under soggy cardboard boxes, soaked through with rain and rot. Her hair was plastered to her cheek with blood and rainwater. Her lips were blue eyes closed, and for a moment he thought she was dead. His chest clenched with something savage. The baby's cries still rang in his ears, mingling with the echoes of his son's last gasp in a hospital room 4 years and a lifetime ago. He skidded the pickup to a halt on the gravel shoulder, wrenched open the door, and bolted into the downpour. "Miss!" he shouted over the roar of wind and water. No response. His boots splashed through icy puddles as he crouched beside her fingers, pressing against the pulse point in her neck. There, faint, thready, but there. Relief hit him so hard, his vision blurred. He slid his arms beneath her, grunting at the effort of lifting her limp, sodden body. Her tactical vest bit into his forearms, and the radio clipped to her belt clacked against his knee. Rain hammered his back as he staggered upright, her head lolling against his shoulder, hair trailing down his chest like seaweed pulled from a river. He carried her to the truck and laid her across the back seat, covering her with the Army surplus blanket he kept for emergencies. Thunder rattled the frame as he slammed the door and ran around to the driver's side. Bailey whined softly from the passenger seat where he lay curled on the blanket nest, the babies tucked against his belly for warmth. His eyes were half-lidded with exhaustion and pain, but his ears flicked at the sight of the woman, and his tail thumped weakly once against the seat. "I know," Buddy Lucas rasped, shifting the truck into gear. "I know." He turned onto the old logging road tires, spinning in the mud before gripping. The wipers squealed across the windshield, barely keeping up with the deluge. His headlights cut through the curtain of rain in ragged beams, illuminating the twisted trunks of ancient firs lining the rutted track. At the cabin, he lifted her again, every muscle in his back screaming with strain, and carried her inside. The dog whined from the couch as he passed his dark eyes, following the woman with desperate intensity. Almost there, Lucas panted, laying her gently on the wool rug before the fire. He stripped off her tactical vest, checking for bleeding wounds. A goose egg swelled at her temple, caked with dried blood and grit, but otherwise, her vitals were stable. She was freezing, though. Hypothermic. He needed to warm her core temperature before shock set in. He peeled away her soaked jacket and shirt, wrapping her torso in a flannel blanket. Her skin was clammy under his calloused fingers, muscles twitching involuntarily from cold. Her breathing came in shallow rasps, chest hitching with each inhale. Lucas shifted to check the babies, tucking an extra fleece throw over them, where they lay, nestled against Bailey's chest. The golden retriever licked their foreheads, once tail giving a weak wag before flopping limp again. His eyes never left the woman on the rug. Lightning lit the room in stark brilliance. For a fleeting instant, Lucas saw them all, as if from outside himself, the dying dog cradling 2 infants. The unconscious woman curled on the floor and himself crouched in the middle of it all, drenched to the bone, hair dripping, eyes wild. "God," he whispered into the thunder. "What do you want from me?" But the storm gave no answers, only rage and rain and wind screaming through the trees. He knelt beside her again, pressing 2 fingers to her carotid pulse. Stronger now. Good. He reached for the towel on the hearth, dipping it in the basin of warm water and wiping dried blood from her temple. Her lashes fluttered against his thumb. She groaned softly, brow knitting. "That's it," he murmured, voice hoarse with exhaustion and relief. "Come on back, officer. Come on." Her eyes opened a crack. Slate gray ringed with gold near the pupils. Sharp eyes, even dazed. She blinked, pupils narrowing against the flickering firelight. "Where?" Her voice was raw, shredded by screaming and cold. She coughed, lips cracking with the effort. "Where am I?" "Safe," Lucas said quickly. "You're safe. My name's Lucas Miller. I found you outside the Maddox warehouse." Her eyes darted around the room. the couch, the stove, the ancient timber beams of the ceiling. Then her gaze caught on Bailey. The dog's head lifted half an inch. His tail thumped weakly against the blanket. Chloe's eyes widened, her pupils dilating with shock and recognition. "Bailey?" she croaked. He let out a low, rumbling whine, his jaws parting in a ghost of a smile. Chloe's chest hitched on a sob. Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and silent, mingling with the rainwater dripping from her tangled hair. She tried to sit up, arms shaking with effort. Lucas pressed a firm hand to her shoulder. "Easy," he said. "You're hypothermic and concussed. Don't move too fast." Her gaze snapped to his face, sharp and assessing despite her condition. "The babies," she rasped. "The babies, where?" A soft wail cut her off, thin and tremulous, rising into the warm cabin air like a prayer. Chloe's head turned eyes wide with disbelief. Lucas stepped back, allowing her line of sight. Bailey lay with his massive head resting across both infants, his nose pressed gently to their bellies. Their blankets were soaked, but their chests rose and fell with life. One let out another cry, fists waving in tiny, trembling arcs. Chloe's face crumpled. The sob tore from her throat before she could stop it, raw and broken and beautiful in its agony. She covered her mouth with shaking fingers, shoulders shaking as tears streamed down her cheeks. Lucas swallowed hard, his own eyes burning. He crouched beside her again, resting a tentative hand on her back. Her skin burned hot under his palm, despite the cold clamminess. "They're alive," he said quietly. "They're alive because of him. Because of you." She turned her face to him, eyes wet and desperate, and so fiercely alive it made his chest ache. You don't understand," she whispered. He saved them. He saved them." "I know," Lucas said. "I know." For a moment they just sat there, the storm raging outside, the fire crackling behind them, and the baby's cries filling the small room with the promise of life. Chloe reached out with trembling fingers, brushing them across Bailey's nose. He whined softly, his eyes slipping closed as her touch soothed the pain only he knew. "Good boy," she whispered through her tears. "My good, brave boy." Lucas looked away, blinking back his own tears. He rose to his feet, moving to the kitchen to start another pot of water boiling. Behind him, Chloe cradled Bailey's massive head in her lap, rocking slightly as she cried, the baby's quiet wails mingling with the sound of rain against the windows. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark, unearthly brilliance. The scarred soldier, the broken woman, the dying dog, and the two infants, who had somehow survived a world determined to snuff out their light. And in that flash, for the briefest instant, Lucas thought he saw something else in the shadows beyond the window. A tall man, broad-shouldered, in an old denim jacket and work boots. His face was weathered and kind-lined with sun and grief, and his eyes burned with a love that transcended death. The figure lifted a calloused hand in silent benediction. Then the lightning faded, and he was gone. Lucas stood trembling, staring into the darkness beyond the glass, his breath fogging the window pane. He pressed his palm against the cold glass, heart hammering. "Whoever you are," he whispered into the storm, "thank you." Behind him, Chloe's tears finally slowed. She bent her head over Bailey's and whispered words only he could hear. His tail thumped once more, weak and final, before stilling. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, deep and resonant, shaking the earth down to its bones. Inside, for the first time in years, Lucas Miller felt something shift in the hollow place behind his ribs. Something broken, realigned, clicking into place with painful, exquisite precision. Purpose, hope, redemption. The woman sobbed quietly. The babies cried. The dog breathed shallowly, holding on with the last scraps of his strength. And the storm raged on. The storm had settled into a low, steady roar outside the cabin walls, wind brushing through pine needles in mournful sighs. The rain relentless as grief drummed against the tin roof in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. It should have been soothing. It wasn't. Chloe sat slumped against the rough-hewn timber wall near the wood stove, knees pulled up to her chest, arms wrapped around them to stop the tremors that racked her thin frame. Her wet hair clung to her cheeks in dark ropes. Her lips were cracked from dehydration and the impact of the blows she'd taken hours before. Across from her, Lucas knelt by the babies where they slept in an improvised nest of towels, flannel shirts, and fleece blankets laid before the crackling stove. Their breathing had steadied, though their tiny chests still rose and fell with fragile effort. He'd stripped off his outer layers, working in just a thermal undershirt, as sweat shone on his temples despite the cold draft slipping through the window seams. Neither spoke for a long time. Words were too small for moments like this. Bailey lay on his side across Chloe's bare feet. His golden fur was matted with drying blood, the bandages around his shoulder already soaked through again. Each breath shuddered from his broad chest with a tremor that rippled down to his paws. His eyes were half-closed lids, fluttering as if he were chasing something just beyond the darkness. A rabbit. A ball. Her voice calling his name across an autumn field. Chloe's fingers threaded into the rough of his neck nails, scraping dried blood clots tangled there. Her thumb stroked the coarse fur along his ear, a rhythmic motion that steadied her, even as it broke her. Lucas finished checking the baby's pulses and turned to her. His brown eyes were dark hollows above the sharp cut of his cheekbones. Lines fanned out from the corners too deep for a man his age carved there by sun sand and grief. "Talk to me," he said quietly. "Who are you running from?" Chloe let out a breath that rattled in her chest. Her tongue felt thick in her mouth, dry as ash. She closed her eyes for a moment, summoning the strength to speak. "We're not running," she whispered. "We're trying to stop him." Lucas cocked his head, waiting. She swallowed, throat working around the lump of terror that lived there. Rain hammered against the window, a deafening percussion that underscored every ragged word. "His name is Ethan Maddox, CEO of Helix Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Public face of a billion-dollar biotech empire. Private face of something much darker." Lucas shifted closer, folding his legs under him to sit at her level. His broad hands rested on his knees, fingers flexing with a restless tension he didn't bother hiding. What did he do? Chloe's gaze flicked to the babies sleeping before the stove. Their faces were peaceful, untroubled by the truth, waiting to consume them. Tears burned her eyes, blurred their tiny features into watercolor smears. "He buys them," she whispered. "Through charities, foundations, crisis pregnancy centers, homeless shelters. Anywhere desperate women will sign away rights for bus tickets and grocery cards." Her voice broke, chest hitching around a silent sob. "He experiments on them, Lucas. Stem cell harvests, neural tissue mapping, gene editing trials. They're just raw material to him." Lucas inhaled sharply through his nose. His jaw flexed once, twice. Then his voice dropped to a low rumble, vibrating through the dim room. "Why would anyone do that to babies?" Chloe's laughter cracked out of her like dry sticks snapping underfoot. It was a terrible sound, jagged with rage and despair. "Because they can't say no," she spat. "Because they don't fight back. Because their deaths can be buried under corporate paperwork and medical waste logs." She pressed her face into Bailey's neck, the smell of wet fur and old blood grounding her as her shoulders shook. Lucas scrubbed a hand down his face, dragging his fingers across the stubble, rasping along his jaw. Outside, thunder rolled across the forest long and low, a sound older than language. "How do you know all this?" he asked. Chloe lifted her head, eyes bloodshot and glassy. Her cracked lips curled in a bitter parody of a smile. "Because I've been undercover for 6 months inside Helix Meridian's charitable foundation. Because I've seen the shipping invoices for incubator units sent to off-grid research sites. Because I heard him order a disposal protocol for 2 babies who had congenital heart defects." Her gaze shifted to the babies, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "And because tonight," she rasped, "I heard him order the termination of all remaining unviable subjects before dawn to erase the evidence." Lucas felt his heart constrict in his chest, a fist of old pain squeezing until his breath came in short, ragged gasps. Before dawn. He glanced at the babies, then at the dog sprawled protectively across Chloe's feet. Bailey's eyes flickered open for a moment, pupils blown wide with pain. His tail thumped weakly once, then fell still again. Blood seeped slowly from beneath the bandage on his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across the wool rug. Chloe followed Lucas's gaze and pressed her forehead against Bailey's massive skull. Her voice cracked like old timber. "He's dying," she whispered. Lucas swallowed hard, throat burning. "I know." Silence settled between them, heavy with truth. The only sound was the pop and hiss of the wood stove and the ragged rasp of Bailey's breathing. Then Chloe spoke, her voice low and urgent, each word dropping into the dim cabin like stones into deep water. "If we don't stop him by dawn," she said, "he'll disappear every record, every child, every technician who ever touched this program. He has shell corporations in 3 countries ready to absorb the research data, offshore accounts to pay off regulators. Even if he loses the public brand, his black market patents are worth billions." Her eyes locked onto Lucas's gray and storm dark. "Those babies will die," she said, her voice flat with certainty. "Just like the others?" Lucas felt something crack open in his chest, an old wound splitting along the scar tissue. His son's face swam up from the depths of memory, blue lips and glassy eyes, a voice in his head screaming, "Do something, do something, do something," until the scream became his own. He reached out and laid a calloused hand on her shoulder. Her skin burned under his touch, fever warm from shock and exhaustion. "What do you need?" he asked. Chloe's eyes filled with tears that spilled silently down her bruised cheeks. She looked down at Bailey. His eyes were closed now, breathing, shallow ribs fluttering against her feet. A tremor rippled through his flank, his paw twitching as if chasing rabbits in a dream. Her fingers tightened in his fur. "I need time," she whispered. I need him to hold on long enough for me to finish this." She lifted her gaze to Lucas, and in that look was every prayer she'd ever whispered in darkness, every vow she'd ever sworn to the dead. "I need him to live," she said, voice breaking. Lucas swallowed the lump rising in his throat, nodding once. "Then let's make sure his sacrifice means something." Outside, the storm raged on tearing branches from trees, lashing the forest with rain and wind. Inside, the woman, the broken soldier and the dying dog, huddled close around the flickering stove, the baby's soft sighs a fragile counterpoint to the thunder. Chloe bent low, pressing her lips to Bailey's ear. Her tears dripped onto his blood-clotted fur. "You did good, boy," she whispered, her voice trembling with love and grief. "You saved them. You saved them all." Bailey's tail thumped once a single final beat of gratitude against the floorboards. Then his breathing evened out into slow, shallow rasps. His eyes fluttered open just enough to meet hers. And in that moment, as thunder cracked overhead and the babies whimpered softly in their sleep, Carter felt her heart break and heal in the same breath. Because there, in the dying gaze of her best friend, she saw the truth her grandfather had told her all those years ago. A good dog never leaves behind the ones who need him most, not even at the end. The wind moaned through the pines outside the cabin, rattling the loose shutter against the window frame in a haunting rhythm. Rain slashed against the glass in diagonal sheets, washing mud from the driveway into swollen rivulets that snaked toward the dark tree line. Inside, the stove crackled softly, casting flickering orange light across rough timber walls and the worn braided rug. Bailey lay curled in front of the hearth head, resting on Chloe's outstretched palm. His breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of his chest a labor. Blood seeped slowly through the fresh gauze at his shoulder, staining the white bandage with dark crimson blooms. Chloe sat cross-legged beside him, her free hand stroking the damp fur along his ribs. Her fingers trembled with exhaustion and grief, nails caked with dried blood from where she'd clawed at her restraints in the freezer. The babies slept curled together on a nest of towels behind her, their tiny breaths whistling softly in the quiet room. Lucas crouched at the woodpile near the stove, adding another log with deliberate care. The flames licked up around it, sparks dancing in the draft. He closed the stove door with a soft click and rested his forearm against the cool, iron headbout. For a long time, neither spoke. Words felt too thin, too fragile to hold the weight of what lay between them. Then Lucas sank down onto the rug opposite her, folding his long legs under him with a sigh that scraped raw from his chest. His dark eyes flicked to Bailey, then to Chloe, lingering on the bruises darkening her cheekbone and the blood crusted along her hairline. "I need to tell you something," he said, finally, his voice low and rough. Chloe didn't look up. She traced the shell of Bailey's ear with her thumb, feeling the tremor in his cartilage as he struggled to stay conscious. "Why?" He exhaled a ragged gust that ruffled the hair falling across his brow. "Because if we're going to finish this, if we're going to save those kids, you deserve to know who you're trusting." Chloe lifted her eyes to his, then gray and storm-bright, the kind of gaze that sees past words to the marrow of truth beneath. Lucas swallowed hard and looked away, his gaze unfocused, fixed somewhere deep in memory. His hands fisted against his thighs, knuckles whitening with the force of it. It was 8 years ago, he began, his voice hollow. I was a trauma doc with the 75th Ranger Regiment, forward operating base near Ghazni. We were pinned down for 6 hours after an IED took out our convoy. 3 dead, 2 critical. I was working on Staff Sergeant Rivas. He was bleeding out from a femoral artery tear. No morphine left. We'd used it all on the others. He was screaming. Lucas's jaw clenched so tight the tendons stood out along his neck. His chest hitched once a silent sob he forced back down. I gave him ketamine to dissociate him so I could clamp the artery without him thrashing. But I was tired. We'd been awake for 40 hours. I miscalculated the dosage. His BP tanked. Respiratory arrest. He coded before we could intubate. He scrubbed both hands over his face, pressing his palms against his closed eyes, as if to block out the vision playing behind them. I killed him, he whispered, voice cracking. He would have died anyway. That's what command said in the inquiry. Massive blood loss. But I killed him faster. I ended his pain, but I ended him too. Chloe said nothing. The stove crackled. The babies sighed in their sleep. Bailey let out a low whine, shifting against her palm. She felt his paw twitch where it lay curled against her ankle. Lucas dropped his hands to his lap, staring at the blood caked in the creases of his knuckles. I got an honorable discharge, he said dully. Commendations for life-saving under fire. They gave me a medal and a folded flag for my locker. But his wife? She sent me a letter. His voice dropped to a near whisper. She said, "I hope you know his name when you wake up screaming at night." He drew in a shuddering breath, eyes shining with tears he didn't let fall. I left, came back here, been existing ever since. Silence settled between them again, thick with unspoken understanding. Rain tapped against the windows, like fingertips seeking entrance. Thunder rumbled low in the distance, the storm moving east toward the coast. Chloe bent her head, resting her forehead against Bailey's. His breathing hitched a shallow gasp, but his tail gave a faint thump against the rug. "My turn," she said softly. Lucas blinked, startled. His dark eyes locked onto hers across the dim cabin. "I was 5 when my mom left," Chloe said, her voice quiet and even. "She put me in a shopping cart at a Safeway in Portland and walked out. They found me 2 hours later, covered in melted popsicle from the freezer case I'd raided." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Foster care chewed me up for a few years. Bounced between families until I ended up with my granddad. Old school. Retired K-9 trainer for the state police. He didn't say much, but he fed me, gave me chores, built me a bed with his own hands, and when I turned 18, he gave me Bailey." Her fingers curled in the dog's fur, feeling the thin, rapid thrum of his pulse against her wrist. Bailey was supposed to be a patrol dog. Best nose in his litter. Smart, stubborn, fearless. But he flunked out. Her lips twitched in a faint smile. Failed bite work. Wouldn't engage a decoy no matter how hard the trainers pushed him. But he could find anything. Drugs, bombs, lost kids. My granddad used to say, "This dog's got a heart too soft for bite suits, but too strong to ever give up." Her eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks in silent trails. When Granddad died, Bailey became my whole world. My partner, my family. The only soul who never asked me to be anything but myself. Bailey let out a low whine, his paw twitching again. His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment his dark eyes opened, meeting hers with a gaze so deep it swallowed her whole. His tail thumped once, twice before falling still. Lucas watched them in silence, his throat tight. The stove crackled, casting warm orange light over the woman, bent in prayer over her dying dog, tears dripping from her chin onto his blood-matted fur. Outside, the storm began to break the rain, slowing to a steady patter against the roof. Wind whispered through the eaves, rattling loose pine needles onto the tin in soft, irregular rhythms. Chloe wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and looked up at Lucas. Her gray eyes burned with something fierce and unbreakable. "I can't lose him," she whispered, voice trembling. "Not tonight." Lucas nodded slowly. His chest ached with old grief and new purpose. "Then we won't," he said. He shifted forward on his knees and laid a broad, calloused hand on Bailey's ribs. The dog's skin twitched under his touch, a soft growl rumbling in his chest that faded into a sigh. Lucas felt the tremor of pain beneath his palm, felt the rapid, thready pulse fluttering against his fingers. "He's a fighter," Lucas said quietly. "Just like his mom." Chloe let out a choked laugh that turned into a sob. She bent her head to Bailey's again, pressing her forehead to his with trembling desperation. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, Bailey. Stay with me. Just a little longer." Bailey's eyes fluttered open again, dark and liquid, and full of love. His tail lifted once in a single feeble wag before falling still. But his gaze stayed locked on hers, unwavering. Committed. Resolute. Lucas watched them, tears slipping silently down his unshaven cheeks. Outside, the clouds broke apart, revealing a thin sliver of moonlight that spilled through the rain-streaked window, casting a pale silver glow across the sleeping babies, the grieving woman, and the dying dog who had given everything for a promise he refused to break. And for the first time in years, Lucas felt the fractured pieces of himself begin to knit back together along the fault lines of compassion and purpose. Because in that dim cabin, surrounded by death and life and love, he finally understood. Salvation wasn't found in forgetting the dead. It was found in fighting for the living. The first fingers of dawn clawed at the black horizon outside the cabin window, scraping gray light across the forest canopy. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hush so profound that even the drip of melting ice from the eaves sounded loud in its stillness. Inside, Chloe sat slumped against the kitchen counter. Her tactical shirt peeled back from her left shoulder, where the bruising spread in sickly purples and browns. Blood crusted along her collarbone flakes, drifting to the faded linoleum as Lucas worked silently. The babies slept, nestled together in a plastic laundry basket lined with towels, their tiny fists curled beneath their chins. Bailey lay on his side before the stove chest, rising and falling in thin, ragged breaths. Lucas grunted as he pressed the butterfly bandage tight against the gash along her clavicle. Chloe sucked in a sharp hiss, her nails scraping the countertop behind her. "Sorry," he muttered. She let out a humorless laugh, breathless with pain. "Don't be. I've had worse hangovers." His lips twitched at that, but his eyes stayed focused, dark and intense. He wound fresh gauze around her shoulder, taping it in place with swift, efficient motions honed on battlefield casualties. His hands were steady despite the tremors in his arms from fatigue. When he finished, he sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. Chloe tilted her head to look at him, studying the deep grooves etched around his mouth, the stubble shadowing his sharp jawline. "You were a medic?" she asked softly. He nodded once, not meeting her gaze. "Army Ranger Regiment. Trauma doc." She exhaled, pressing her good hand to the bandage, feeling the warmth of her own blood seeping through the first layer. "Lucky me." Lucas rose, joints popping, and crossed to the battered oak desk in the corner of the kitchen. He flicked on a dusty desk lamp illuminating a tangle of wires, an ancient Dell laptop, and a cracked tablet propped up by a coffee mug. Now he set his voice low and measured. "Tell me exactly what you need from his system." Chloe swallowed hard, her throat dry and raw. "I need the server room entry codes for Helix Meridian's East Wing labs," she rasped. "That's where they're holding the babies, and where the off-grid data backups are stored." Lucas booted the laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard with surprising speed. Chloe watched him chest tight with hope she couldn't afford to name. "You hacked too?" she asked. "Combat support medic with S6, cross-training." He muttered, eyes locked on the screen as lines of code scrolled past. Half my deployments were black site recon with SIGINT integration. Medical comms and cybersec. Cheaper than sending 3 men. Chloe blinked at him, half in shock, half in awe. "Jesus. No wonder you live in the woods." He snorted softly, the sound dry and bitter. "Yeah. It's quieter out here. Less screaming at night." Bailey whined from the hearth, his paws twitching as if he were chasing rabbits through sunlit grass instead of bleeding out on a cabin floor. Chloe pushed herself upright with a groan, swaying slightly as her vision flickered black at the edges. She limped across the kitchen, dropping to her knees beside him. His eyes flickered open at her touch. Pupils dilated with pain. His breath wheezed in and out, each exhale ending in a soft whimper he couldn't suppress. She stroked his muzzle tears, sliding silently down her cheeks to drip onto his blood-matted fur. "Hey, big guy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Listen to me." His tail thumped once against the rug, a hollow echo in the silent room. Chloe swallowed the sob rising in her throat, leaning down until her forehead rested against his. "If I survive this," she said softly, her lips brushing the velvety fur between his eyes, "you're getting foie gras for breakfast every damn day." Bailey let out a faint huff, almost a laugh. His tongue flicked out to taste the tears running down her cheek, and his tail gave another weak thump against the floorboards. Chloe closed her eyes, pressing her face harder into his. "Don't you dare leave me, Bailey," she whispered. "Not yet." Behind her, Lucas's fingers clattered across the keys, the low hum of his laptop fan filling the cabin with a sound like distant wind through reeds. The monitor glowed pale blue in the pre-dawn gloom lines of code flickering past as he breached layer after layer of Helix Meridian's network security. "Got admin protocols?" he muttered. "Jesus, they're running off mirrored dark web shells with triple redundancy." Chloe forced herself upright, one hand pressed to her bandaged shoulder, the other gripping the countertop to steady herself. She limped across the cabin to stand behind him, peering over his shoulder at the scrolling data. "Can you get in?" she asked, her voice tight with hope and fear. Lucas's mouth twitched in something almost like a smile. "I already am." He tapped a few more keys, and the screen shifted to a live feed from the Helix Meridian East Wing server room. Men in lab coats bustled between racks of blinking machines, tablet screens glowing ghostly blue in their hands. In the far corner, Chloe spotted rows of steel bassinets, each with a tiny bundle swaddled in sterile white. Her breath caught in her throat, a sob trapped behind her teeth. She pressed her fist to her mouth, eyes burning with tears. "Those are the babies," she whispered. "Oh God, they're still alive." Lucas glanced up at her, his eyes dark with resolve. "Not for long," he said. "Their data node purge is scheduled for 06 Honduras. They're pulling out before sunrise." Chloe blinked, her mind spinning. What time is it now? 5:12. She sucked in a ragged breath, forcing her brain to focus past the pain fogging her senses. "Can you access their environmental controls?" she asked. "The labs run on closed HVAC loops. If we trigger a contamination alert protocol, locks down all doors and notifies state health inspectors within minutes." Lucas nodded, his fingers already dancing across the keys. "And Ethan Maddox." Chloe's gaze burned with fury. "He'll be in his penthouse suite overseeing the purge remotely. But if you shut down the internal comms grid, he won't get the abort signal in time." Lucas's lips twitched in grim approval. Savage. Necessary, Chloe growled. Bailey let out a low whine behind them, his paws scrabbling weakly against the rug as if trying to stand. Chloe turned and dropped to her knees beside him again, cupping his massive head in her trembling hands. His eyes opened, a sliver glazed with pain, but burning with love so fierce it stole her breath. "You rest now," she whispered, pressing her lips to his ear. "I'll finish this." His tail thumped once against the floor, and his eyes slipped closed, his breath evening out into shallow hitching rasps. Lucas watched them, something twisting in his chest so hard it hurt to breathe. Then he forced the feeling down and turned back to the screen. His fingers moved with ruthless precision, bypassing firewalls and encryptions with practiced ease. Each keystroke was a hammer blow against the monster that had built this empire of suffering. "Environmental controls overridden," he said. "Contamination alert primed for manual trigger." Chloe pushed herself upright again, swaying with fatigue. Her bloodied fingers clenched into fists at her sides. "Do it." Lucas met her gaze, his eyes dark and unflinching. Then he pressed enter. On the screen, red warning lights began to flash across the lab feed. Technicians dropped their tablets and scrambled for hazmat suits. The automated voice of the facility AI crackled through the speakers, calm and robotic. "Biohazard alert. Containment protocol engaged. Evacuate immediately. External regulatory notification in progress." Chloe let out a ragged sob of relief, pressing her fist to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. Lucas reached for his satellite phone with his free hand, flipping it open and punching in a number from memory. The line clicked once before connecting. "Sheriff's office," a sleepy voice answered. "This is Dr. Lucas Miller." He said, his voice low and calm, despite the adrenaline roaring in his blood. "You need to send every available unit to Helix Meridian Pharmaceuticals East Wing Labs. Now." "Sir." Now Lucas barked. "Infant abduction victims. Biohazard protocol breach. Full tactical response." There was a stunned pause, then the dispatcher's voice hardened into crisp professionalism. "Understood. Units en route." Lucas snapped the phone shut and turned back to the screen. Chloe's breath came in shaky gasps, tears dripping from her chin onto the keyboard as she watched the babies being lifted from their bassinets by hazmat-suited officers. Their tiny fists waved weakly, faces scrunched in confusion and fear. "They're safe," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They're safe." Behind her, Bailey let out a soft whine. Chloe turned, crawling back to him on trembling hands and knees. She laid her forehead against his tears, soaking into the blood-matted fur between his eyes. "We did it," she whispered. "You did it, Bailey." His tail thumped once, feeble but determined. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, pupils dilated with pain, but burning with a fierce, unbreakable love. Lucas watched them, his chest tight with grief and something older, deeper, the fragile, indestructible hope that maybe, just maybe, salvation was still possible in this broken world. Outside, the first sliver of dawn broke over the dark horizon, casting pale gold light across the drenched forest. Inside, a woman, a soldier, and a dying dog waited for the sun to rise on the day they took back hope from the jaws of hell. The sun had not yet broken the horizon, but the black of night was beginning to thin, revealing the bruised purple clouds hanging heavy over the pine ridge. Inside the cabin, the air hummed with the static buzz of the satellite uplink. On the laptop screen, the live feed from Helix Meridian streamed in shaky handheld footage. Panicked technicians, rows of steel bassinets, hazmat suits, scooping babies into rescue incubators under flashing red emergency lights. Lucas's fingers flew across the keyboard, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Sweat dripped from his temples, cutting rivulets through the dirt, and blood streaked across his face. "Transmission locked," he muttered, eyes flicking to the second monitor. The FBI live database interface glowed pale blue in the pre-dawn gloom, a progress bar inching steadily toward completion. "Come on, come on." Chloe stood behind him, cradling the two infants against her chest in their bundled towels. Their small bodies were warm now, but their breathing still hitched with weakness. She could feel their tiny heartbeats fluttering against her ribs like trapped moths. Bailey lay beside her, head resting on his outstretched paws, eyes half closed. Each breath rattled in his chest, shallow and painful. His tail thumped once against the floorboards. When she shifted her weight, his gaze flickering up to her face, tired but unwavering. On the laptop, a green checkmark flashed across the screen. "Upload complete," Lucas rasped. He slumped back in the chair, exhaling shakily. "Every federal agency in the country has that evidence now. Ethan Maddox is done." But even as he said it, an alarm pinged softly from the secondary terminal. Chloe's head snapped up, eyes narrowing as she scanned the scrolling code. "He's tracing the signal," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "He knows we're here." Lucas's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. He reached under the desk, dragging out a battered green duffel. The zipper screeched as he yanked it open, revealing 2 matte black pistols, spare magazines, a shotgun with a cut-down stock, and a box of 12-gauge slugs. Chloe's eyes widened. "You're a doctor?" "Yeah," he said, racking the shotgun with a clack that echoed through the small room. "But I'm also a realist." Outside, the distant growl of engines rumbled up the mountain road. Headlights flickered between the pines, sweeping across trunks in white strobing arcs. Bailey let out a low growl, his ears twitching forward despite his weakness. "They're coming," Chloe breathed. Lucas moved fast, sliding the duffel across the table toward her. "Take my Glock. Safety's here. Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to kill." She shook her head, tightening her grip on the babies. "I can't fire and hold them." His eyes met hers across the dim cabin, dark and calm, despite the terror rising like bile in both their throats. "Then run," he said quietly. "Take the back door. Head north through the creek bed. They'll track you on foot, but it'll buy you time." "What about you?" she asked, her voice breaking. Lucas chambered a slug into the shotgun and flicked the safety off. The steel barrel gleamed dully in the flickering lamplight. "I'll keep them busy," he said. Bailey struggled to his feet with a strangled whine. His legs trembled, his paws sliding on the blood-slick floorboards. Chloe dropped to her knees beside him, tears spilling down her bruised cheeks. "No," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. "You're too hurt. You can't." But he was already moving, turning in a slow, staggering circle until he faced the back door. His tail hung limp between his legs, but his ears were pricked forward, and his eyes burned with an ancient canine resolve, older than fear itself. Lucas grabbed her shoulder, dragging her up to her feet. "Go!" he barked, his voice sharp with urgency. "Run now, Chloe. Run!" Outside, the first black SUV skidded to a stop in the muddy clearing tires, spraying gravel. Armed men spilled out of the vehicle, rifles up, dark tactical vests gleaming with rainwater. Another truck pulled in behind it, then a third. "Cabin secured," a voice shouted. "Move in." Chloe clutched the babies tighter against her chest and stumbled toward the back door. Bailey limped after her, leaving a trail of blood drops across the cracked linoleum. Lucas watched them go, shotgun braced against his shoulder, his chest heaving with adrenaline. When Chloe reached the door, she turned her tear-streaked face, illuminated by the flickering lamp. "Don't die, Lucas," she whispered. "Don't you fucking die." He flashed her a grim smile, the first real smile she'd seen on his face. "You too." Then she was gone. Slipping into the pre-dawn darkness, Bailey's massive body pressed against her leg as they disappeared into the trees. Lucas turned back to the front door just as it exploded inward in a shower of splinters. A black-clad figure lunged through the smoking threshold rifle, sweeping the room. Lucas fired. The shotgun roared like thunder in the small cabin, the slug punching the intruder off his feet and into the wall behind him. "Contact front," someone screamed outside. More gunfire erupted, the staccato pops of suppressed submachine guns, mingling with the deep booming blasts of Lucas's 12-gauge. He moved methodically, retreating deeper into the cabin as he fired, each slug punching through drywall, shattering windows, ripping into men he didn't see as human anymore. Only targets, only threats. His chest burned with exertion, ears ringing with each concussive blast. Blood dripped from a shallow graze along his ribs, where a round had glanced off his armor. His hands were slick with sweat, the recoil bruising his shoulder with every shot. Outside, Chloe stumbled through the trees, branches whipping across her face, mud sucking at her boots with every desperate step. Bailey limped beside her, his breath ragged his blood, leaving a faint trail along the mossy forest floor. Behind them, the cabin pulsed with flashes of orange light as Lucas fired again and again. Each shotgun blast echoed through the trees like a death knell. Chloe clutched the babies tighter against her chest, tears streaming down her face. "Almost there," she whispered. "Almost there, babies. Stay with me." Bailey whined softly, pressing his flank against her leg as if to lend his strength to her failing limbs. His tail flicked once, a feeble wag before falling still again. They reached the creek bed, the cold water shocking her skin as she splashed down into the knee-deep flow. The babies whimpered in her arms, their cries muffled against her chest. She turned upstream, moving as fast as she could against the current, each step a battle against exhaustion and fear. Behind them, gunfire erupted in rapid bursts. The deep booming of Lucas's shotgun fell silent, replaced by the sharper cracks of handgun fire. Then even that stopped. Chloe froze, chest-heaving, tears mingling with the icy water dripping from her chin. Bailey pressed against her, his body trembling with cold and blood loss. She looked down at him, meeting his gaze in the dim dawn light filtering through the trees. "We can't go back," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We can't." Bailey licked her wrist, his tail giving one last weak thump before falling still against the water. The first rays of sun broke over the ridge, casting pale gold light across the forest floor. The creek glittered around them, cold and swift and unforgiving. Chloe took a shuddering breath, squared her shoulders, and turned upstream once more. The babies whimpered softly, their tiny bodies trembling against her chest. Bailey limped beside her each step, leaving a swirl of blood in the clear water. Behind them, the cabin burned black smoke rising into the dawn sky like a funeral pyre for the man who had bought them the time they needed to run. And in the rising light of morning, Chloe Carter swore an oath she would carry to her grave. I will finish this. For them, for him, for all of us. The whine of the helicopter blades cut through the crisp dawn air like a saw through bone. Wind whipped across the clearing, flattening grass and sending dust and pine needles swirling into the blood-stained mud. Ethan Maddox climbed the metal steps leading up to the waiting helicopter. His tailored suit streaked with dirt, the polished leather of his shoes coated in congealed blood from the men who had tried and failed to protect him. His hair whipped across his forehead in the rotor wash, the icy dawn wind slicing through the silk of his tie. Behind him, his last two security guards scanned the tree line with suppressed rifles, eyes flicking between shadowed trunks and shattered outbuildings smoldering with dying flames. The smell of gunpowder and burning wood lingered in the clearing, mingling with the metallic tang of spilled blood. "Move it!" Ethan barked, clutching the helicopter doorframe with white-knuckled fingers. "We're out of time." Then a voice cut through the thrum of the rotor blades, thin and hoarse, but carrying all the fury of a thunderstorm, condensed into a single ragged scream. "Ethan." He froze, his body half turned toward the helicopter cabin. His pale eyes narrowed as he scanned the clearing. Between the skeletal trunks of two blackened pines, Chloe Carter stepped into view. She was covered in blood, some dried brown, some still fresh and seeping from the gash bandaged tight against her collarbone. Mud streaked her tactical pants up to her knees. Her hair was plastered to her cheeks with sweat and tears. In her trembling hands, the matte black Glock looked almost too large for her battered grip. But her eyes burned with something cold and immortal, a fury older than the dawn breaking across the tree line behind her. Ethan's lip curled in disgust as he raised his chin, squinting against the rising sun. "Agent Carter," he drawled, his voice carrying over the whipping blades. "Alive after all. I should have paid better for that freezer job." Her chest heaved with shallow breaths. Blood dripped from her fingertips onto the muddy ground. "You're done," she rasped. Ethan smirked. "I don't think so." He stepped fully onto the helicopter landing skid, gripping the support bar as the pilot's headset crackled an all clear. Then a sound cut through the rotor thunder, a ragged growl, deep and primal, vibrating through the earth itself. "Bailey." He limped out of the tree line behind Chloe ribs, heaving with each desperate gasp. His fur was matted with blood, every step leaving a smear of red across the frost-streaked grass. His ears pinned back against his skull teeth bared in a snarl that twisted his dark lips back to his molars. Ethan's smirk faltered. He shifted his grip on the helicopter frame, sneering down at the dying dog. "You again," he spat. "You should have drowned with those worthless babies." Bailey's growl deepened, vibrating through his entire broken body. His eyes flicked to Chloe, meeting her gaze with a depth of love and sorrow, so fierce it stole her breath. Then he charged. The helicopter pilot shouted something unintelligible through his headset as Bailey launched himself up the metal steps, jaws snapping closed around Ethan's wrist. Bone crunched beneath the force of his bite. Blood sprayed across the helicopter cabin, spattering the tinted windows in bright arterial arcs. Ethan screamed a high, ragged shriek that cut through the rotor thunder. He staggered sideways, clutching at Bailey with his free hand, fingers clawing at the golden ruff around his neck. Bailey's back legs scrabbled against the metal steps, claws screeching against the aluminum, but he held on with all the savage, righteous fury of a creature who knew the difference between monsters and masters. With a final wrenching twist of his massive head, Bailey yanked Ethan off balance. The man's expensive shoes slipped against the blood-slick metal, and he tumbled down the steps, crashing onto the muddy ground below with a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. Bailey collapsed beside him, chest heaving, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "No!" Chloe screamed, charging forward. Her boots churned mud and pine needles as she sprinted across the clearing. Ethan rolled onto his side with a strangled groan, clutching his shattered wrist to his chest. His eyes darted up just in time to see Chloe level the Glock at his forehead. For a long, frozen moment, the clearing fell silent. But for the fading whine of the helicopter blades and the ragged wheeze of Bailey's labored breathing. "Do it!" Ethan spat, his pale eyes burning with venomous hate. "Do it, you pathetic little bitch! Pull the trigger! Prove I was right about you!" Chloe's arms shook, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and grief. Tears blurred her vision, streaking down her blood-streaked cheeks in silent rivers. Her finger curled against the trigger, tightening with every ragged breath. Behind her, a shout erupted from the tree line. One of Ethan's security men staggered into view, rifle raised, eyes wild with fear. Before he could squeeze the trigger, a thunderous crack split the dawn air. His chest exploded in a spray of red, and he toppled backward into the undergrowth. Lucas stepped out from behind a burned-out stump, the smoking barrel of his shotgun braced against his shoulder. Blood trickled from a cut above his brow, mixing with the soot streaked across his face. His eyes were dark hollows, above the muzzle cold and empty and unflinching. He turned to Chloe, his voice ragged with pain. "Finish it!" Chloe turned back to Ethan. The man lay sprawled in the mud, blood pooling beneath his shattered wrist. His chest heaved with panicked sobs, spit bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Please," he croaked, his voice breaking. "Please, don't!" Chloe's breath hitched. Her finger tightened on the trigger. For a moment, the world narrowed to the black circle of the barrel and the ruined, pleading face behind it. Then she lowered the gun. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to escape consequences this time." She turned to Lucas, her voice shaking with fury. "Call them." He nodded once, pulling his radio from his belt. "Sheriff's Department," he barked into the mic. "This is Dr. Lucas Miller. Ethan Maddox is down at the logging heliport. Medical and tactical support required. Secure him alive." Bailey let out a low whine. Chloe dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands to his broad chest. His breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps. Blood foamed at the corner of his mouth, each exhale weaker than the last. "Stay with me," she whispered, tears dripping onto his blood-matted fur. "Please, Bailey. Stay with me." His tail thumped once against the muddy ground. His eyes flickered open, meeting hers with a depth of love so fierce it burned her to the bone. Then his chest rose one final time and fell still. A broken sob tore from her throat as she buried her face in his ruff, clutching his limp body against her chest. Lucas sank to his knees beside her, resting a bloodied hand on her trembling shoulder. Around them, dawn broke over the ridge, casting gold and crimson across the clearing where Ethan Maddox lay screaming in the mud, his empire in flames behind him. And above them, the first rays of sunlight kissed Bailey's still broken body, illuminating the hero's quiet sacrifice with a brilliance that made even the burned pines bow their charred heads in mourning. Red and blue strobes shattered the dawn, splashing across burned tree trunks and torn earth like the world's longest sunrise. The rumble of armored vehicles shook the clearing as tactical boots pounded mud weapons, raised voices barking orders into the thin morning air. FBI hands in the air. "Clear right. Move, move, move. Secure the perimeter." Agents flooded the logging heliport rifles, sweeping the smoldering wreckage of Ethan Maddox's private militia. Smoke curled into the sky from the burned-out cabins, mingling with the thin morning mist in ghostly veils that drifted between the pines. Ethan lay face down in the mud, his wrist twisted at an unnatural angle, where Bailey's jaws had snapped the bone clean through. His designer suit was soaked in blood and sludge, his hair matted to his forehead. Tears streaked muddy rivulets down his dirt-caked cheeks as agents yanked his arms behind his back and slapped cold steel cuffs around his trembling wrists. Ethan Maddox, an agent, growled, hauling him upright by the collar of his ruined suit. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, murder, and violations of federal human trafficking statutes." Ethan let out a broken sob as they dragged him away from the helicopter steps. The engine still idled overhead, rotors slicing the dawn light into whirling shards that flickered across the clearing. Behind them, Chloe knelt in the churned mud, her tactical pants soaked through to the skin. Her hands slick with blood and ash were buried deep in Bailey's golden ruff. His fur was matted with gore, sticky and dark where the bandages had soaked through, and each shallow breath rattled weakly in his broad chest. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice shaking as tears streamed down her bruised cheeks. "Please, Bailey, stay with me." Bailey's tail flicked once a feeble thump against the mud. His ears twitched, straining to catch her voice through the fog of pain and shock dimming his world. For a moment his eyes fluttered open, dark brown and soft as river stones flecked with gold where the dawn touched them. Chloe let out a sob that shook her entire body. She bent forward, pressing her forehead to his, her tears soaking into the blood-caked fur between his eyes. "Bailey," she whispered, her voice breaking around his name. "You did it. You saved them. You saved all of them." His breathing hitched in his chest, each ragged inhale shorter than the last. His eyes locked onto hers, pupils dilated with pain, but burning with that unbreakable canine devotion that had carried him through gunfire, through rain, through a night so dark, even hope itself had seemed to falter. She could feel his pulse weakening beneath her palms, fluttering like a trapped moth in the hollow beneath his jaw. "Hey," she choked out, forcing her voice to steadiness as her tears fell onto his muzzle. "Hey, listen to me, big guy. If you stay with me, if you hold on, I swear." She swallowed hard, fighting the sob rising in her throat. I swear, Bailey, if you make it through this, you're getting foie gras for breakfast. Every damn day. I'll buy out the whole market if I have to. His tail flicked again. Just once. A tiny, exhausted wag that sent a fresh flood of tears pouring down her face. An FBI medic skidded to a stop beside her combat boots, sending up sprays of mud. His gloved hands reached for Bailey, fingers probing gently along the dog's ribs as he shook his head grimly. His lungs are filling with blood, the medic said softly. There's nothing we can do out here. Don't say that. Chloe snapped, her voice cracking with desperation. She pressed her palms to Bailey's chest, feeling the shallow rise and fall of his ragged breaths. Don't you dare say that. The medic met her gaze, eyes soft with pity behind his ballistic goggles. I'm sorry. Chloe let out a broken sob and bent lower over Bailey, her hair falling in a curtain around his face. His eyes flickered up at her one final time, pupils blown wide with pain, but burning with a fierce, gentle love. Bailey, she whispered, tears dripping from her chin onto his nose. Bailey, you were my best boy, my only boy. You saved them. You saved me. You saved the whole world today. His breathing hitched again, a low whine rumbling deep in his chest as his tail flicked one last time against the mud. His ears twitched toward her voice, straining for every syllable. Chloe pressed her forehead to his, closing her eyes as her tears fell in silent rivers down her cheeks. Bailey, she whispered, her voice shaking with a grief so deep it carved hollows into her bones. You saved my whole world. His chest rose once more and fell still. A thin, strangled cry tore from her throat as his final breath left his body in a soft sigh, carrying with it every promise he had ever made her, with those brown, soulful eyes. The medic bowed his head, rising silently to his feet to give her space as her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Around them, the clearing bustled with agents and paramedics, voices crackling over radios in clipped urgency. Ethan Maddox screamed curses as they dragged him toward the waiting SUVs, his voice raw and broken with panic. Get off me, I built you. I own this country, do you hear me? I own it. But Chloe heard nothing beyond the quiet stillness of Bailey's body pressed against her knees, his fur soaked in her tears. Lucas stumbled through the tree line, his face smeared with blood and soot shotgun, dangling limp from his good hand. His chest heaved with exhaustion as he took in the sight before him. He dropped to his knees beside Chloe, his free hand resting gently on her trembling shoulder. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice rough with grief and old pain. I'm so sorry. She shook her head, choking on a sob as she buried her fingers deeper into Bailey's blood-matted ruff. He saved them, she whispered, her voice breaking. He saved everyone. He saved me. Lucas bowed his head, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion and sorrow as the sun finally broke over the ridge, spilling pale gold light across the clearing. The helicopters overhead cast long, shifting shadows across the ground, and for a moment, the flickering blades caught Bailey's fur, illuminating him in a soft, radiant halo. Around them, agents swarmed the clearing, medics, tending to the wounded, tactical teams, sweeping for stragglers. But in that tiny space where Chloe knelt with Bailey's head cradled in her shaking hands, there was only silence, only grief, only love. Lucas reached out, laying his palm gently over Bailey's still chest. His eyes burned with tears that welled up and slid silently down his soot-smeared cheeks. He was a good boy, he whispered, his voice hoarse. The best boy. Chloe let out a broken sob, her tears falling faster now as she pressed her lips to Bailey's cold nose. He was my world, she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the hum of engines and the crackle of radios. He was my whole world. Bailey's tail lay limp in the mud, still and silent. But in that dawn light, with the sun rising over the blackened pines and the first birds beginning to sing in the branches above, it seemed to Chloe that he was smiling. That somewhere beyond the pain, beyond the blood, beyond the silent dark where all good dogs go, he was running free through golden fields beneath an endless cloudless sky, and waiting, always waiting, for her. The Oregon morning was soft in golden sunlight spilling over the ridge in long honeyed beams that lit the damp grass with fleeting sparkles of dew. Chickadees called from the cottonwoods lining the creek, their voices bright in the quiet dawn. High overhead cirrus clouds drifted in feathery sweeps across a pale blue sky. Chloe Carter stood on the hillside above the training field, her hands tucked into the pockets of her fleece-lined jacket. The breeze caught wisps of hair from her braid, lifting them across her cheek in gentle brushes. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the cool, pine-scented air. It smelled like hope. Behind her, the Bailey's Light Rescue K9 training center buzzed with early morning activity. New handlers moved across the dirt agility course, Voices calm and encouraging as German shepherds, Belgian Malinois, and Labrador mixes scrambled over A-frames and darted through weave poles. In the far paddock, 2 trainers practiced wilderness air scent drills, rewarding an eager golden retriever who had just located the hidden volunteer under brush cover. Lucas Miller leaned against the paddock fence, clipboard under one arm, steaming travel mug of black coffee cradled in his large hands. His hair was longer now, curling slightly at his collar, streaked with sun-bleached gold. The dark hollows had faded from under his eyes. When he saw Chloe standing on the hill, he smiled. A slow, quiet smile that reached all the way into the deep lines at the corners of his eyes. She waved him up with a tilt of her chin. He nodded once, set down the coffee, and jogged across the grass to join her. "Morning, Chief," he said, sliding his arm around her waist. The smell of soap coffee and clean sweat rose from his skin, grounding her in a safety so profound it made her knees weak even now, a year later. "Morning, Doc," she murmured, leaning into his side. She could feel the strength in him, coiled and quiet, no longer rigid with guilt and old pain. Below them, the children's voices drifted across the grass. 2 toddlers bundled in fleece jackets, despite the warming spring sun, toddled after a shaggy old border collie mix, giggling as he wagged his tail and trotted just out of reach. "Easy, Liam," Chloe called softly. "Stay close to your brother." The little boy turned, his dark hair ruffling in the breeze, and grinned at her with a gap-toothed smile. His twin Caleb lifted his arms and babbled something only toddlers understood, toddling faster after the dog. Lucas chuckled, the sound deep in his chest. "They're getting faster. Thank God for old Duke," Chloe said, nodding to the border collie. "He herds them better than any nanny ever could." For a moment they stood in silence, watching the boys play. The sun rose higher, gilding their dark heads and throwing their long shadows across the grass. "You ready?" Lucas asked softly. Chloe nodded. Her throat tightened around the word she couldn't speak. She turned away from the field and started up the gentle slope toward the oak grove at the top of the hill. The boys followed their little boots, kicking up sprays of dew as they scrambled up the path after her. At the crest of the hill beneath the largest oak tree stood a simple granite marker. The grass around it was worn flat from many visits. Wild daisies bloomed in small white constellations across the mossy earth. "Bailey's grave." Chloe knelt before the marker, brushing fallen oak leaves from its smooth surface. Her fingers traced the carved letters, "Bailey, a good boy who saved the world." Her eyes burned with tears that welled up and slipped down her cheeks, dripping onto the stone. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small tin of foie gras, the label bright gold in the morning light. She set it carefully on the grass beside the grave. "Told you," she whispered, her voice shaking with grief and love. "I promised, didn't I? Every damn day." The breeze lifted, rustling the oak branches overhead. Sunlight dappled the grave, flickering across the stone like dancing spirits. Behind her, Liam and Caleb stumbled to a halt, their tiny hands clinging to the hem of her jacket. Caleb bent down and patted the grave with his chubby palm, babbling softly to the marker. Liam watched his brother, then pressed his cheek to the cold granite, his eyes closing in a silent toddler prayer only angels and old dogs could understand. Lucas rested his hand on Chloe's shoulder. She reached up, gripping his fingers tightly. "We wouldn't be here without him," she said softly. "No," Lucas agreed. His voice broke around the word. "We wouldn't." She closed her eyes, remembering. Bailey charging through gunfire with 2 babies, clutched in his jaws. Bailey limping beside her through rain and mud, his eyes locked on hers with unbreakable devotion. Bailey launching himself up the helicopter steps, jaws clamped around Ethan Maddox's wrist, dragging a monster from his throne, with the righteous fury of a creature who knew what love was worth. Bailey lying in her arms, his breathing ragged, his eyes never leaving hers as his world faded to darkness. "You saved my whole world," she whispered, tears falling faster now. "All of it, all of us." The breeze shifted again, and for a moment she could almost hear his collar tags jingling as he bounded up the porch steps, could almost feel his warm weight pressed against her legs as she curled up on the couch to read reports late into the night. Could almost hear his heartbeat steady and strong and fearless thumping against her chest in the darkness. The boys scrambled away to pick daisies, their childish laughter rising into the brightening morning. Lucas knelt beside Chloe, sliding his arm around her shoulders, pulling her against him. She buried her face in his neck, breathing in the scent of soap and pine and clean sweat until her tears slowed. When she lifted her head again, the sunlight had risen fully over the ridge, flooding the grove in warm gold. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her wrist and leaned forward, kissing the cool granite marker. "Rest easy, Bailey," she whispered. "Your watch is over." Behind them, the boys ran back, fists full of crushed daisies. They dropped the flowers onto the grave, their small faces solemn for reasons they didn't understand, but felt deeply in their blood and bones. Lucas scooped Caleb up into his arms, pressing his lips to the boy's dark hair. Liam wrapped his arms around Chloe's leg, burying his face in her knee. Chloe rested her hand on the granite, feeling the warmth of the sun soaking into the stone. "He was a good boy," she said softly. "The best," Lucas whispered. The breeze rustled the oak branches overhead, and in the quiet that followed, a voice drifted across the grove, soft and deep and filled with love. "A good dog never leaves behind the ones who need him most." Chloe closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks as her grandfather's voice echoed through the dawn. She rose slowly, lifting Liam onto her hip. Lucas took her free hand in his, together with their sons nestled against them, and the sun rising bright and strong behind their backs. They walked down the hill toward the training fields below. The camera rose slowly, lifting above the oak grove, panning out to reveal the training center spread across the green valley, dogs racing across the agility courses, handlers guiding them with calm, loving voices. In the far paddock, a shepherd mix barked joyfully as it bounded over a jump tail, streaming behind it like a banner of hope. And beneath the largest oak tree bathed in golden light, a simple granite marker glowed softly in the morning sun. "He saved the world." Fade out. A final image flickers across the screen. Bailey as a young dog, standing in the rain, with his ears pricked forward, his dark eyes burning with devotion as thunder cracked overhead. The raindrops glisten on his golden fur like diamonds in the storm-dark night. Then his eyes shift, and for a single fleeting moment, they look directly into the camera, into the soul. And her grandfather's voice echoes one last time, deep and gentle, filled with pride. "A good dog never leaves behind the ones who need him most." Cut to black.